In 2001, Swedish scholar Trygve Medinger published The Riddle of Resurrection, Dying and Rising Gods in the Ancient Near East. The funny thing about this work is that it's appealed to by both skeptics and Christian apologists. It's appealed to by skeptics because it affirms that there were at least a few bona fide pre-Christian dying and rising gods. And it's appealed to by apologists because toward the end of the book, Medinger also had this to say: "There is, as far as I'm aware, no prima facie evidence that the death and resurrection of Jesus is a mythological construct, drawing on the myths and rites of the dying and rising gods of the surrounding world. While studied with profit against the background of Jewish resurrection belief, the faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus retains its unique character in the history of religions." Aww, Jesus' resurrection is special and thoroughly Jewish. Mazel tov! Yeah, yeah, yeah! L'chaim! The real question, of course, is what are Medinger's reasons for saying this? Lucky for us, he tells us on that very same page. So let's dive into it. Number 1. The figures we have studied are deities. In the case of Jesus, we are confronted with a human for whom divinity was claimed by himself and by his followers. Let's follow that logic. Romulus was a deity. In the case of Caesar Augustus, we are confronted with a human for whom divinity was claimed by himself and by his followers. What is overlooked here is that prominent humans in the ancient world were often deified according to popular mythic tropes of the time. Augustus was certainly a real human boy, but he was nonetheless deified in the image of the legendary Romulus, depicted ascending to heaven to become a god for the benefit of the Roman people, just like his father Julius Caesar. Jesus was likewise deified in the image of ancient Near Eastern sacral kingship. As the late biblical scholar Philip Davies put it, the profile of Jesus in the New Testament is composed of stock motifs drawn from all over the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. Like Baal and Osiris, Jesus is victoriously exalted after death, raised to a new status and office. Osiris was bodily restored to life and enthroned as ruler and judge in the netherworld, the Egyptian version of heaven, wherein the deceased were bodily restored to eternal life like Osiris. Baal, the son of God, or El, was exalted to the heights of Mount Zaphon to reign upon his throne as king of gods and men. Christ, like Baal and Osiris, conquers his enemies and most importantly conquers death. In the primitive myths of Baal and Osiris, death is actually embodied as an enemy, Mot or Seth respectively, while it is treated as an abstraction in the New Testament, though still an enemy to be overcome and defeated. Ancient Canaanite and Egyptian imagery are replete throughout the Bible, persisting well into New Testament times, with Revelation's talk of divine judgment and reward in the form of a paradisiacal forever after, or punishment in the form of a second death in an ominous lake of fire, much like the ancient Egyptians. Jesus isn't an identical copy of Baal or Osiris, but such ancient Near Eastern resurrection and vindication myths form the general template, the mythic grooves by which later stories in the ancient Mediterranean world were culturally conceived. Medinger goes on, For the disciples and for Paul, the resurrection of Jesus was a one-time historical event that took place at one specific point in the Earth's topography, whereas, and this is number 2, the dying and rising gods were closely related to the seasonal cycle. Their death and return were seen as reflected in the changes of plant life. The death and resurrection of Jesus is a one-time event, not repeated, and unrelated to seasonal changes. This one, incidentally, is a favorite among Christian apologists, such as Ronald Nash's old The Gospel and the Greeks did the New Testament borrow from pagan thought, which leads me to wonder if Mettinger is just repeating more of the same here. At any rate, while some of the gods under Mettinger's study experienced cyclical descents to the underworld and back, like Dumuzi, Adonis, and Baal-Hadad, others did not. Inanna, Osiris, and Orphic Dionysus, for instance, had one-time death and resurrection motifs which were celebrated annually, much like Easter is today, but not thought to happen repeatedly. As Robert M. Price explains, the objection that Jesus' death and resurrection was uniquely historical, not cyclical and nature-based, is somewhat mitigated by the fact that it seems the ancient pagan myths drew the distinction that their deities too had once died and risen in the remote past, but that these events were magically recalled each year to celebrate or even to facilitate the resurrection of vegetation. Mircea Eliade's research, The Sacred and the Profane, Cosmos and History, etc., has made ancient thinking clearer on this point. The yearly celebrations did not imply a lack of historicity. The gods had died and risen at some particular time in the past. They could even show you the grave of Zeus in Crete. But this sacred time of origins is mystically recalled each year to impart creative reality anew. The idea, in fact, is just like that of the Christian Eucharist, as far as I can see. Jesus Christ died once for all. He will never die again. Yet his death is recalled, made present again at every Eucharistic celebration. Meanwhile, the New Testament retains the imagery of the death of the planted seed and its sprouting to new life, reminiscent of the agricultural mysteries associated with many of these divinities. Christ is the first fruits of all those to be raised, invoking the imagery of the harvest. Paul even utilizes the terminology of these ancient mysteries, including mysterion, mystery or secret, teleos, perfection or maturity, and nepios, babe or infant, not to mention the salvation schema by which devotees ritually participated in the death and resurrection or new birth of dying rising figures like Osiris or Dionysus, imparting salvation and renewed life whether in this world or the next. Next up from Mettinger is number 3. The death of Jesus is presented in the sources as vicarious suffering, as an act of atonement for sins. There is no evidence for the death of the dying and rising gods as vicarious suffering for sins. Of course there isn't. The atonement theology attached to Jesus' death on the cross stems from the sacrificial cult of Judaism, reflected also in the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 and Eliezer in 4 Maccabees. This is a distinctly Jewish element of Christian origins. But Christianity is a syncretistic mixture of ancient Near Eastern, Greco-Roman, and Jewish ideas. So there are inevitably going to be Jewish tropes in Christianity that you don't find in the pagan cults. Likewise, there are pagan tropes in Christianity that you don't find in Judaism, like ritually sharing in the death and resurrection of the god, or sacramentally consuming his flesh and blood. Even by ancient Jewish standards, that's just gross. Mettinger insists that we should study the resurrection of Jesus against the background of Jewish resurrection belief. And this is partially true, but Judaism itself was an ancient Mediterranean religion in active participation with mythic and religious currents of its time. Baal and Osiris were known to many Israelites. Biblical scholars like John Day, John Levinson, and Lloyd Geering demonstrate that the earliest resurrection tropes in the Hebrew Bible, those in which resurrection is a metaphor for national revival, are inspired by the Canaanite myth of Baal's death and resurrection. And Judaism was not the sole matrix through which Christianity emerged. By the first century, Judaism had been thoroughly Hellenized, inviting a slew of mythic and literary motifs from the surrounding world, not least among them the apotheosis myths of the Greco-Roman world, in which figures like Asclepius, Heracles, and Aristeus were raised up from death to become immortal gods that lived in heaven and appeared again to those on earth. Just look at where Jesus is situated in both time and place among these other risen and immortalized figures. All in all, to say that the resurrection of Jesus is strictly Jewish is a massive oversimplification. To review, Mettinger states that there is no prima facie evidence that the death and resurrection of Jesus is a mythological construct, drawing on the myths and rites of the dying and rising gods of the surrounding world. Prima facie meaning on the face of it. But I would say that on the face of it, the resurrection of Jesus looks like mythologized history, combining the crucifixion of Jesus with Jewish expectations of resurrection and popular myths about risen divinities who were exalted to reign in a higher or heavenly realm. Thus, contra Mettinger, the resurrection of Jesus does not retain an entirely unique character in the history of religions. Mettinger appears to show his hand on the very same page when he speaks of the fact and import of the death and resurrection of Jesus. The fact and import of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Mettinger takes the resurrection of Jesus as fact because Mettinger is a Christian. On his webpage, he states, "I try to draw a line between what I believe I know as a scholar and what I know I believe as a Christian." Hello! Christian commenters and YouTube apologists have accused me of committing an ad hominem fallacy for pointing out Mettinger's prior faith commitments. But is what I'm saying really fallacious? What are the chances that a guy who believes the resurrection of Jesus to be historical fact is going to say, "This looks like a mythological construct, derived in part from myths and rites concerning dying and rising gods in the surrounding world"? I should say, not good. Not good. And when we see how factually and logically challenged his arguments are on this front, and how much they resemble Christian apologetics like that of Ronald Nash, I'd say we're well within our right to be mighty suspicious.
Don't you find that a wee bit suspicious?
That's the end of this episode. Guys, if you have enjoyed this episode and if you've gotten something from it, please consider joining my Patreon. There's plenty of goodies there, including these online PDF presentations that you can download for your own use, as well as a short online book. And also, if you really want to help out, consider contributing to my PayPal. The link is included in the description of this video. Given the amount of cash I've had to invest in getting everything up and running as optimally as possible so that I can do live streams and so forth, it's really put me in a bind financially, and whatever you can do to help, if you've enjoyed this program and learned from it, would be massively appreciated. Huge thank you and huge gratitude and appreciation to all of my current patrons and to all those who have joined in on my live streams and provided funds with the super chats and with contributions to the PayPal. I cannot thank you enough for keeping me afloat and believing in me. So thank you so much. This has been Atheologica, where religion is both fascinating and stupid.